Today's hearing is the risks of progressive ideologies in the U.S. military.
Chairman Grothman and Ranking Member Garcia and committee members, thank you for the opportunity to speak to the committee. I served in the U.S. Army for 36 years. My wife is an Air Force brat, daughter of a fighter pilot. During our career, she supported families in peace and war. For that entire time, we lived on Army posts and one Navy base, raised our two boys. My son Peter, who is with me today, served in the 1st Cavalry Division. We are an Army family for life. I have 3 points to make today. First, the United States Armed Forces are the best in the world because we reflect and represent the greatest country in the world. Diversity is the military's strength because diversity is America's strength. Second, the military makes significant social changes primarily when Congress demands it. When President Truman ordered the military to desegregate in 1948, it didn't really happen until the 1970s when Congress demanded it. The military reacts to Congress, not the other way around. Third, the military's half-century commitment to equal opportunity and diversity has created a more lethal, effective, and cohesive force. In 1971, the military was falling apart. Race relations were at its nadir and drug use at its peak. Over the next 20 years, DoD instituted and internalized a culture of diversity that transformed the military. Diversity has worked for over 50 years. For the last half of my career, I taught history at West Point and studied the history of our Army. In fact, I brought for both the chair and ranking the West Point history of the Civil War that we wrote while I was there. In 1948, President Harry Truman issued Executive Order 9981 integrating the U.S. military. It couldn't go through Congress because segregationists blocked civil rights legislation. Without laws, the military slow-rolled integration. The last segregated military unit disbanded in 1954. In 1963, 10 states still had 0 black National Guardsmen. As late as 1969, Mississippi had 1 black National Guardsman, not 1%, 1. In the 1960s, the Army had 3% black officers, and the Navy and the Marine Corps 0.2%. Black service members could not rent houses outside some bases. The children of black service members still went to segregated schools as late as 1969. By the early 1970s, the effect of the Vietnam War, drug use, and racial prejudice had created a broken military. The quote-unquote race problem threatened our ability to defend the nation. In 1971, senior civilian leaders created the Defense Race Relations Institute. They mandated race relations training for the entire force. Recruiting for the all-volunteer force forced the military to integrate and to try to solve the race problem. It worked imperfectly. Less than 20 years after the defeat in Vietnam, the U.S. military shined again. In 1991, during Desert Storm, we destroyed the 4th largest army in the world in days, and that army had 31% African-American NCOs. The success of equal opportunity policy saved us after the defeat in Vietnam, created the all-volunteer force, and led us to victory. I know I commanded a diverse cavalry troop in the 82nd Airborne Division during the Gulf War. By law, women weren't allowed to serve in tank, infantry, and cavalry regiments for most of my career. It's just un-American and ineffective. When the Army deploys, it fights on land, and 8 billion people reside on land, 51% of whom are women. We must have women in the force at all ranks. At West Point, I taught a cadet who was unable to follow her dream to be an infantryman. While she was a Rhodes Scholar, the combat exclusion ended. She rebranched infantry, graduated from Ranger School, and commanded an infantry company. She was the toughest, brightest cadet I met in 20 years. When I commanded a battalion, we suffered under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, a policy that forced service members to lie. A friend deployed to Iraq. Her partner and their children could not access military facilities. No commissary, no health care, no child care. Now, because Congress ended Don't Ask, Don't Tell, we have another proud military family. In both my experience and my study of history, diversity policies, equal opportunity policies, are neither progressive nor political. They are proven national defense strategies that have made our military more effective and our country safer for over 50 years. Thank you again for allowing me to join you today in the People's House.
General Sedulli, thank you for joining us today. I appreciated your testimony especially, and I want to thank you for the decades of service, of course, to your nation. I want to start by just getting a few facts out of the way quickly. I'm sure that anyone who saw the movie Oppenheimer, which was my favorite movie of the year, is familiar with the Red Scare, and obviously you as a historian also are familiar with the Army McCarthy hearings, which seem to be replayed over and over again in this House. Now, I'm disappointed that some of my colleagues also seem to want to replay those hearings and those scare tactics. But since you're here, I just want to ask you very clearly, is the military being destroyed by Marxist ideology?
No, it's not. Excuse me, no, it's not, and I don't really even understand how you can say it's Marxist. At least I studied Marxism, and I don't understand how it relates at all.
I agree with you, sir. And in your experience as a professor also at West Point and in your 36 years of service in uniform, did you see any evidence of leftist indoctrination?
No.
How about of critical race theory?
No.
Have you ever seen Antifa infiltrating our military?
No.
Well, thank you, General. Now, I'm sure we can all feel a bit better knowing that there is no large communist menace or Antifa or others plotting to overthrow the U.S. military, which we know remains the strongest in the world, and we all, I think, in a bipartisan way, agree that we have the best military in the world and that we're very proud of. Now, General, in all seriousness, can you explain why policies that promote a military that reflects the diversity of our country and allows everyone to serve no matter who they love, one that protects female soldiers from harassment, and actually promotes and improves our national security, how does that actually how does that improve our actual military?
Thank you, Congressman. I really believe that we look at a period before we had this, which is the 1960s, and see how terrible the military was. And the military imploded without that. And if we have an army, that's what I'm familiar with, that has right now, over 20% African American, and yet have almost no leadership in that role, then we're going to have problems. We don't have quota system. I was on the admissions committee at West Point. We don't have quotas there, but we do want to make sure that that we look like our client. Our client is the American people, and we want to make sure we reflect that. I have found that diversity policies make us a stronger nation and a stronger country, and I'm unfamiliar with anything that make diversity policy somehow is going to melt our brains in some way when we take them. It's not been my experience.
And I would agree. I mean, it's clear that a more diverse military is good for our national security and is good as a reflection of the whole country. And I think the question is do we want a military that actually reflects the entire country? As an LGBTQ American myself, I also understand very clearly that it wasn't that long ago that an openly gay person, an open person from my community, could not contribute their talents in the military, but it's been changes to policy and implementation that have made our military more reflective of who we are as a society, and so I appreciate your comments. General, can you remind us about some of the challenges our military has had to overcome as it relates to segregation and as it relates to racial tensions within ranks?
Yes, remember, we were a segregated Army really into the 1970s. We had very few cadets at West Point. We had only 23 naval midshipmen in 1970. That's 0.5%. We continued to have very low levels of general officers and in the Army and in all services into the 1990s and beyond. So we have always had a problem making sure that the Army leadership or the military leadership reflects the enlisted ranks. And when we don't do that, we have problems. And we saw that in the 1960s and the 1970s. It's the same thing with other underrepresented minorities. But remember, it's this body that changed it. It ended Don't Ask, Don't Tell. It brought women to West Point. It ended the combat exclusion. Congress is the one that did that. Congress is the one that really changes the military.
And General, would you agree that it's been, like you said, it's been laws, it's been the intervention by Congress, it's been policy changes that have actually had to have been forced sometimes on the military to actually improve diversity amongst its ranks?
It's only been that usually. We did not integrate when there was an executive order. It was only when Congress did in the 1973 Equal Opportunity Act that really started that and put equal opportunity people in every battalion in the Army.
And so I think it's pretty clear that in order to achieve a military that reflects the rest of the country, Congress needs to push and create action. And I appreciate all the efforts that have happened in the past to actually create a military that reflects the country. And this idea that we should go backwards or that we shouldn't embrace diversity, to me, is totally insane and crazy. Finally, what actually poses a bigger military threat to national security? Policies to promote cohesion and tolerance and diversity within our military, or a historic disruption to officer promotions caused by Senator Tuberville's publicity stunt?
Senator Tuberville, I think Senator Sullivan probably said it best on the floor. Why punish people who seriously sacrifice for America? Why punish patriotic military members over a policy dispute they had nothing to do with and can't fix? This is a huge readiness challenge and a huge morale challenge. And yet, amazingly, Not one member of those general officers ever made a public complaint about it. It shows the professionalism of our General Officer Corps that no one made a complaint despite the disruption and cruelty of that policy by Senator Tuberville.
Thank you, sir. And again, I reiterate that that's the hearing we should be having, is on that enormous disruption that happened in the Senate and how the House can help rectify that. Thank you, and I yield back.
Do that. Regarding the comment that there was a defeat in Vietnam, I want to make sure, because I grew up during that time, as you did, I imagine, sir, just gauging from seeing you here, it was not a military defeat. It was people like Walter Cronkite and other leftists and political activists in the United States of America that imposed that defeat, and it's important to me. I revered my uncle when he came home from Vietnam in his uniform as a guy who served and the sacrifices he made, and it colored my decision to join the military. And it's important, again, for the record, to remind Americans that the military did not lose that war. That was a politically lost war, and I don't want that to be attributed or ascribed to the military. Regarding the McCarthy hearings, I want to remind everybody in the room that while I disagreed with his tactics, as most Americans did, if they read Whittaker Chambers' book Witness, and if they go through the Venona transcripts, almost every single person he named was a communist sympathizer, organizer, and involved in the subversion of the United States government. Let's not forget that. Regarding those folks that were held up by by Senator Tuberville, and the fact that they didn't complain, well, good for them. Because when we wear the uniform, yours is not to question why, yours is just to do and die. Our military is being destroyed right now, and we all know it. We all know it. And while I wish and I hope that it still remains the best military in the world, I'm not sure that that's the case anymore, and we better damn well come to that realization and get after that. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Point out to what my colleague just said, as it relates to members of the United States military whose promotions were being held up because of a senator who had problems from an ideological point of view with bodily autonomy, the message to them was, ours is not to reason why, but to do or die. But then to a gentleman here who did complain and fight, wrote a book about his issues, the message was completely different, which I think shows the hypocrisy in this room right now from the other side of the aisle. I'm from the state of Florida. This war on wokeism is not new to me. And it's a shame that Republicans on this committee haven't caught on to my governor DeSantis' failing presidential campaign that's based on this war on woke. And this misplacement on wokeism in the military endangers America's national security by ignoring the real threats. Some of the real threats to our national security are low military recruitment and retention rates, which is what I want to focus on today. Look, service members aren't leaving the military because of DEI training, or because a military base was renamed, or because someone accessed an abortion. But what I do hear from my constituents is this. I've had folks write about problems with housing allowance being too low in the military. People messaging me about saying medications are too expensive. Folks worrying that service members won't be able to get pay if Republicans in Congress shut down the government. These are the real things that resonate with the American people, because these are the issues that this committee needs to be addressing.
Do you agree? I appreciate that you have opinions and you're entitled to have them, but I'd like you to try to answer the question I'm asking with respect, sir. Do you agree with President Truman's Executive Order 9981 that integrated the armed services despite the fact that separate but equal was still the law of the land at the time?
I agree that the military has led the way in integration and unity, which has been the strength of the United States military, but we're undoing it all with diversity, equity, and
reclaiming my
policies.
time. That decision was progressive at the time. In other words, the military went to a place of integration and efforts to have black and white soldiers working alongside each other. It wasn't always perfect, it wasn't always easy, but it was literally the definition of progress and progressive. It went beyond existing law. General, did Truman's actions to integrate the military under EO 9981 lead directly to any readiness deficits? You're a military historian.
No, in fact, the first thing it did, Congresswoman, was integrate Arlington National Cemetery.
Mr. LeMaire, you were in active duty, and thank you for your service, Air Force officer in 2010. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Were there any big problems in military readiness in 2010?
As a young flyer, I never paid attention to what you folks were doing. I never paid attention to reports on readiness lethality. I simply focused on a mission. It was learning how to fly an aircraft, and at that time, it was training our allied partners and foreign military pilots how to fly jets.
Well, I'm glad, Mr. LeMaire, that you were able to focus on your military duties, and it seems to me that your own testimony here is a really good example of the fact that the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell did not cause a disruption in your ability or the military readiness of the Air Force to do its job. General, is there any empirical evidence that gay Americans serving openly has hurt military readiness?
No.
So historically, when the military has been progressive, has gone beyond where other policies may be, has tried to encourage diversity or welcome people to be diverse and to learn about each other, there has been no harm to force readiness. General, could one consider President Truman's executive action a diversity initiative? Right, General Truman's, why am I having so much trouble with this? General, could one consider President Truman's executive action a diversity initiative?
Yes.
How about the 2010 repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell?
Yes.
So, in your view, should the military roll back those diversity policies?
Absolutely not.
Mr. Thibault, do you think the military should roll back those initiatives?
No, Congresswoman, I don't, because the integration of the armed forces in 1948 was a recognition that the military is different from society, and so it should march to the beat of a different drum. And that's why I think it was such a good policy, because it ensured that we had the best. That things changed in 1960 when the military became a beacon for affirmative action and quotas. But I agree with you that it was good policy in 1948.
Okay. And do you have would you repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell?
No, because it's a means by which the military attracts the best talent. But what I would object to is if the military had a quota for LGBT Americans.
Do they?
On the books. Not that I know of, but they do for Black, white, Hispanic Americans, and I think those are...
General, is that correct? I'm not aware. My brother served. He went to the United States Naval Academy. He served 5 years. He served on a nuclear submarine. I don't recall him ever enforcing, being part of, as an officer, any type of quota system.
There are no quota systems, Congresswoman.
Who do you think is politicizing the military? Is it Senator Tuberville with his anti-choice agenda, where he wants to dictate to all of the women of the military what their access will be to health care? Or is it those women themselves? Are they the ones that are somehow perpetrating a woke agenda by saying that they want to have equal choice? And don't we depend on women in the military these days? Last I saw, it was something like 18 or 20%, even in the Army. So please answer that if you would.
Yes, I would say that Senator Tuberville created political pawns out of those general officers. We have a non-political army, and we're one of the few countries in the history of the world that has never had a military coup d'etat, and it's partly because we are non-political. And yet, Senator Tuberville created political pawns for a policy he disagreed with. I couldn't disagree more with him for doing that and hurting our force and those general and flag officers.
The military also depends on lots of African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans. That's just a reality. You might love it, you might hate it, you might be ambivalent about it, you might just accept it. But in any event, that's the reality, as I understand it. And in any event, the Army decided that it wanted to rename military bases that had been named not after U.S. generals, but after Confederate generals who joined the Confederacy in rebellion against the Union. So, like Fort Benning was renamed after a pro-Union, pro-American general. Fort Gordon was renamed as Fort Eisenhower. Fort Hill was renamed as Fort Walker. And yet, I take it this is part of the big anti-woke arraignment and indictment of the military, that we have renamed military bases after pro-union, pro-American soldiers, generals, people who've been loyal and faithful to the Union, as opposed to those who have opposed the Union and took up arms against the Union in traitorous insurrection. Now, who's politicizing this question? Is it the people who go along with the Army's decision to say that's who our bases should be named after, pro-Americans, or the people who are wanting to stick to the old Confederate battle names? And I'd like you to address that, and also Mr. Lohmeyer, I think you've taken the position against changing the names. Yeah.
Well, remember that the names were changed, Congressman, because this body voted overwhelmingly, overrode the veto of President Trump to create the naming commission, of which I served as vice chair. It was my proudest moment to rename those after true American heroes and not those who chose treason to preserve slavery.
Thank you. And do you agree with that, Mr. Lohmeyer?
I'll say that it's my view that Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin has politicized the military. As soon as the Supreme Court decision was made, he issued a policy memorandum blaming the Supreme Court's decision to reverse Roe v. Wade on the recruitment.
Wait, but I'm asking about the naming. I'm asking about the
I'm
naming of our military bases.
One point that the general made with which I disagree is that diversity is our strength. I don't think there's any evidence for that.
And I want to just end this hearing with some of the comments I made earlier, and just again show I'm just dismayed and disappointed that we are choosing to spend our time this way. I do thank our witnesses, but I think I'm going to do a quick, brief summary of what we've already heard. One, a member chose to use this time to argue that members of right-wing militias should serve in our armed services. That's pretty outrageous. A witness, Mr. Lohmeyer, called the slogan Black Lives Matter a monument to Marxism, which is also pretty outrageous. The same witness claimed that he speaks for all service members, and I just want to note for the record, having talked to many service members before my time in Congress and today, I can say with certainty that he does not speak for all service members, particularly on issues of diversity and inclusion. We had a comparison of also that slogan to military bases named after people who took up arms to destroy our nation, to preserve slavery was discussed. Members decided to relitigate the Vietnam War, which was interesting. We heard anti-vax propaganda, which continues to cost lives in this country. We heard cherry-picked anecdotes from a right-wing ideologue who personally and baselessly attacked members of this committee, speaking to one of our witnesses. The idea that our work today upholds national security is, in my opinion, a joke and crazy. And General, I do want to thank you once again for your clear and insightful testimony. Here are some of the facts. We need to harness the talents of every American, especially in a difficult recruiting environment. That means we need a climate that welcomes people of all backgrounds, that actively combats bigotry and extremism, and then makes all service members ensure that they are protected and supported. I just want to say finally that the arguments being made by two of our witnesses and some of the majority, as a reminder, those arguments have already lost. We are in a diverse military today. Those are arguments of the past. No matter how many times you come forward, write a book, give testimony, or try to move us backwards, you have failed. The Army is diverse, our military is diverse, and the United States will continue to be a place that welcomes diversity, inclusion, and that diversity is here to stay. And with that, I yield back.